Okay, people are coming in as they do at the end of the hour because people are getting off calls. So let's go ahead and get this webinar started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this great IPR webinar, the Fluency Report, Understanding Communications Role in Health Literacy. My name is Tina McCourtendale. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations, reporting to you from a Starbucks in an undisclosed location. Before we begin, please note we will have time for Q&A with our speakers at the end of the webinar. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A box. If you have any questions, feel free to click on that box and type in your questions there. We'll collect the questions and then moderate at the end of the webinar. Please ask your questions only through the Q&A and not in the chat, but you are more than welcome to use the chat to leave comments, interact with fellow attendees if you have any great resources, and we'll share them at the end of the webinar. So let's get to it. So the democratization of information is accelerating. Healthcare consumers are actively seeking out to an ever wider range of information from an expanding range of resources, influencers, and voices to proactively manage their health. And we're seeing a lot of impact now, especially with COVID and vaccine hesitancy and uptake. So according to the Fluency Report, the Health Literacy by Syracuse University, Newhouse School of Public Communications, and the W2O Emerging Insights Lab, companies are not the go-to source. So leading today's webinar is Abby Hayes. She's a practice leader of DE&I engagement at Real Chemistry, formerly W2O. And Jason Davis, he's a research professor in the Office of Research and Creative Activity at Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Public Communications. Thank you so much for being here today. So Jason, with that, I'd like to hand you the floor. Jason, you're on mute.
Yep, there we go. I figured, I was like, do I do that? Do you do that? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much for having us. And you know, thank you, Abby, for taking the time to join us as a deep subject matter expert in this and a bunch of different areas we're going to hit today. And thank you all of you who are in attendance this afternoon for taking the time to join us. And I would say congratulate yourself for being continuous learners. That's a really kind of critical skill set, and this is the kind of thing that continuous learners do. So I appreciate you, sort of joining us today as we walk through what we think are some pretty interesting and exciting results we've got, and the opportunity to look forward in the future. So first of all, the Digital Health Literacy Report, what exactly were we trying to do when we wanted to start this project? Well, we really wanted to get an understanding of the state of digital health and literacy, and if there were any gaps in that sort of health literacy that were being sort of accentuated or closed by the digital and online tools that were available. And of course, that we wanted to look at how online audiences were using those digital tools to navigate and understand the healthcare system and their personal health and well-being as well. So we sort of narrowed down into sort of 5 key topics that were questions that we wanted to try and make sure we were answering. And of course, the first is what digital health literacy topics are trending, what's going up, what's going down, and can we use some of those insights to actually start to be a little bit predictive and understand, well, where are we heading based on where we've come from? We also wanted to understand what were the key themes that were of most interest or concern by the digital audience. And then also, where were they looking to find this information? And on the other side of that equation, who was creating the content that they were able to sort of connect with? And then that gap question of, were the questions that they were asking being addressed by the content that was out there, or that they were able to find? And how does that roll up in general so that we get to that? So why does it matter for the public relations practitioner or the communications practitioner? How does this information help you do your work more effectively and more productively? So as Tina sort of mentioned at the beginning, as a landscaping kind of moment to set the table, the democratization of information is undoubtedly accelerating and growing. It's expanding, and it's actually diversifying and evolving at the same time. Healthcare is no different. The healthcare consumer is now feeling empowered to actively seek out from an ever-widening range of information sources and platforms the kind of feedback and information that they are most interested in and are most connected to. So on the other side of that equation, or that fulcrum, what does that mean as a disruptive moment for corporations, for companies who are no longer the sole source or the gatekeeper of that information? Well, all is not lost. There's still absolutely an important role to play, but when the landscape is being disrupted like this, you have two choices, essentially. You can either join the disruption, or you can try and fend it off as long as possible. If you choose the latter, the absolute risk is you fade off into obsolescence or irrelevance, and it's just a matter of time, not if, but when. So the message here is take charge and own that disruptive environment, and try to sort of be a part of the disruption and leverage it and become part of the new landscape that's evolving. And you can do that by, again, not necessarily having to sort of create content or be these influencers, but rather create the platforms or an aggregation place where you can amplify or be connected with some of these new sources of information that our stakeholders are seeking out. So from that perspective, this is the landscape, this is the reality. The shift is real and it's significant, and it's accelerating. So ignore it at your own peril, I guess, is the take-home message from this moment. So what does this mean? Patients are now empowered to be their own health advocates. They see themselves as being in charge of their own sort of health situations and their ability to go out and address their concerns directly, rather than passively waiting for that information to be pushed to them. So if you do not respect that empowerment, that new perspective, again, you will be quickly disengaged from your stakeholders or your customers, your patients, and then you rapidly become irrelevant to them as a source of trusted information. So that moment, that recognition, that this empowerment for patients to go out hunting for their own information and their own sources of truth is something to be reckoned with. And at the same time, information sources are becoming more fragmented, more diverse, and in some ways, I would argue, more representative of the actual population of consumers and customers that are out there. Audiences are looking for authentic, trusted sources that speak to them, that they feel connected to, and that they see as being like them, or they have a sort of common background, a common story that helps that connection to feel, again, real and authentic. So that moment of digital trust in a source is critical when you think about that fragmentation, that diversity that is emerging out there in terms of information sources. So we think about the traditional communications model. A company sort of takes their message, they make it crystal clear, they get it just how they want it. They have legal team make sure there's nothing in there that they should be concerned about. They set that static message in place, and then they choose their mediums, and then they deliver it. They push it out to their consumers of that information. But again, it's a very static information source, and it's a very, again, sort of pushed interaction, one-way communication from the company out to the consumer or the customer. If we think about this new and evolving model, where it's more of an influence and information model, there's a collaboration here that has to happen. That, yes, there's absolutely that communication strategy at the heart of it, but by tailoring some of the content, you create more engaging, more customized experiences. You can speak to that sort of segmented population more directly, in a more sort of tangible way. And then you can leverage some of the digital trust that's already been created by sort of influencers that your customer base already knows and is sort of engaged with. And again, they're looking for a two-way dialogue here, not that sort of unidirectional communication. And that really does create that longer term connectivity, and that leads to that extended relevance. So in this case, again, it's co-created relevance that is critical, and it's not something that this sort of past model or the conventional model of communication allows for. And so this drives people to seek out other sources of information where they can get not only the information they're looking for, but the connectivity that they crave. it's also really important to understand that they do recognize the difference between those two channels, and they use them very differently. So this is a great example of the difference between search, which is typically directed more towards that conventional source of trusted, factual, clinical data. People here, you can see on the left, almost half of the time, they use that search approach to go after that moment of understanding of a diagnosis. So it's that what do I have? That is a very critical moment in time, but it's also, if you think about it, a very short moment in time of that initial understanding of what my diagnosis is. If we then move over to the social media side of the platform, the social mentions, the dialogue that's happening, the use dramatically shifts. You can see here now that understanding the diagnosis is actually only a small fraction, 6% of the time that they're using this platform for that purpose. Instead, they're using it to understand the how. How do I live with this diagnosis? How do I move forward? Why did this happen to me? You know, sort of that interaction, that dialogue, that they want to be heard as well as to listen. And they're using it to hey, how did you navigate the insurance landscape in this situation for my diagnosis? Somebody tell me who's already done it, that I trust, that I want to get my information that I feel is experiential or lived information rather than, again, that clinical sort of factual information. So again, they're very savvy when it comes to using the two different sorts of mechanisms for very different reasons. I would add one more thing. If you think about, again, the time scale that people spend on that initial diagnosis, it's probably pretty acute, pretty short compared to that, hey, how do I live with this diagnosis for the rest of my life potentially? Or how do I think about preventative sort of opportunities that I can go after? It's really, again, a much longer time scale that they are going to be using these kinds of interactions. So again, if you want to put value on the amount of time that you're connected with your patients or your customers, that second piece is probably actually the much more attractive piece to make sure that you're a part of that conversation. Again, they're no longer passively learning. This is what we see. They're going in, they're hunting for their own information. They're not waiting for that diagnosis to be given to them. They come into a doctor's office with already what they think they have, rather than something's not right, I'm going to go in and let the doctor tell me what I have, right? So this moment of this pivot is really important to recognize and to acknowledge, and then sort of respect and think about when you're creating your messaging. And the influence that they are sort of seeking out is not necessarily one of expertise, right? So it's pretty clear that there's now this broadening or widening gap between expertise as a source of trust and influence or connectivity as a source of trust, right? Do I feel like I know that person, I know what they stand for, they're like me, I identify with them? That seems to be a far bigger trust driver than that, oh, they're an expert, they know what they're talking about, I should listen to them. And you can see that very clearly here. This is actually a list of influential sources for patients in the conversation. The top 12, sort of influencers. Not a single one of them is a medical doctor. Not a single one of them is a medical or healthcare company. In fact, Bill Gates is number 36 on the list. He's the first actual health policy influencer of sort of real efficacy that shows up on the list. Right, so people are turning to other sources and it's not expertise that they're craving, and being aware of that again, that clinical, factual, accurate report on the information is not necessarily the most effective way to reach the audience that you're trying to get to. I would be remiss as well if I didn't sort of point out that last year there was a global pandemic, and these insights were captured kind of in the middle of that. So it's a really, really powerful and interesting snapshot to think about how people were using online tools for digital health literacy during the pandemic, right? So one of the key things that is really jumped out was if you look at 2018, 2019, the diversity of topics of interest was pretty high, and again, pretty evenly distributed. There were lots of different things that people were interested in and were using social tools to try and sort of understand and gain some of that literacy in. 2020 changed all of that. The sort of focus collapsed basically into a very few set of centralized and very closely connected topics. I would even argue that you could put this into two buckets: COVID-19 and then racial sort of equity, access, racial divide, that social justice movement. And those two worlds kind of were the focus for almost all of the online searches and tool needs in digital health. So that's not, I guess, surprising if you think about the backdrop of a global pandemic. Really focusing people on their area topic of concern is almost decided for them. And we really saw that play out in the data. It would be really interesting as we move into 2021 and we do sort of the same sort of analysis. It will be really interesting to see how that evolves, what the attention span or is there going to be a sort of COVID fatigue that will change this search landscape, this sort of digital tool and media, what they're seeking. Will that pivot? We don't know yet, but it will be really interesting. So stay tuned, and we'll unveil that next year for sure. All right, so let me wrap up here. Key findings. First, of course, democratization of information absolutely speeding up. The landscape has already shifted. This is the moment when the disruption is guaranteed. So either I would say get on board or get out of the way because it's here. Again, patients are using this moment in time to say, tell me logically what I need to know, but that's only a small piece of what I want. What I also want is talk to me emotionally. Let me have that dialogue. I want that two-way channel of information exchange. And if you give me that, I will stay connected with you. Secondly, there's, again, this need for additional diverse voices. So we saw that fragmentation and that diversity that is evolving in the channels that people are seeking out when they look for health information. That is also, I hope, growing and accelerating even faster. They want that authentic person that they identify with, that influencer, that sort of group that they feel connected to. And to have enough diversity in that space to actually be representative of the population that you're interacting with is really, it's not there, and it needs to be if you want to be effective. The third sort of point is, again, this difference between the tell me moment, right, and the talk to me interaction that they're seeking. So that conventional one-way communication is becoming less and less critical, and the talk to me interaction is becoming more and more sustainable and more sought after by the audiences. So please think about that very carefully. Pushing information is sort of the way we did it historically. It's not the way that the consumers are looking for it today. And then lastly, of course, they are savvy. They do recognize that different topics can be approached using these different sources. Understanding that landscape and understanding when and how they are using these different social media sort of either search or media platforms is important. And directing your messages in the right time, in the right way, is going to be critical for you to remain effective when you design your communication strategy. Okay, so what? Big takeaways for some of our PR and communications folks. As a company, make sure you understand your role. Again, it's important for you to broadcast and be very clear about your stance, your position, your role and your responsibility in that environment. And then I think it's really also important for you to make sure that, again, that you're understanding your stakeholders are sometimes better at telling your story than you might be directly. So playing the role of creator and convener is probably one of the most effective ways you can approach the transition into this more disruptive communications landscape. and still be relevant. Even if you can't be the actual communicator directly anymore, that's your path to staying engaged. And then recognize where you are on the digital trust scale with your audience. I think that's really important. People, again, won't consume your content and take action from it or based on it if they don't believe you, they don't trust you. So understanding where you are on that scale with your audience is important, and then deciding, okay, I need to sort of leverage other people who already established that connection, that relationship, that authenticity with the audience I want to be a part of in a dialogue, going after it that way. This leads right into that concept of how do you message, right? What language do you use? That concept of clinical, factual, legally tight language is sort of really not effective in this landscape. That community-based, that you're part of the conversation, it is a conversation. Again, it's not that information push. So using language like us and we, creating narratives and stories rather than facts and clinical data, really important to create that emotional connection. And again, to tell the story in a way that is accessible and approachable. And again, not only one direction, but hearing and telling. And from a corporate level, it's also really no longer acceptable to sit on the fence. If you do not have an active and an open stance on social topics, that is something that is very closely monitored by the social media dialogues that are happening. So it's really important for you to have your social or your corporate vision sort of together, your values, your principles well defined, agreed upon, and so you know what you've got and where your mission lies. And then beyond the statement of that, it's really important to take action. That's how you create the stories that you're going to be able to tell, that reinforce and give you that authenticity, that give you that credibility, that you're not just saying the right things, you're living them. And that's a really important second piece to the expectations that our stakeholders will have of us. So that's kind of what I have. Again, it's a very sort of quick snapshot of the full report. If you found it interesting, or you think there's more you'd like to unpack, there's a ton more information in the full report. The link is here. If you are interested in this space, or you'd love to collaborate on something along these lines, please reach out directly to myself, Jason Davis, or my co-director, Gina Luttrell. We'd love to sort of discuss or give you more information as we move forward. This is, again, something that we think is here to stay, and it's going to be important and informationally relevant for the next, every year we do it. So with that, I will stop sharing and get to what I think is for me, the more interesting and exciting part of the session, and that's the discussion with Abby, because I really, with that as a backdrop, I really want to sort of get into some of the nitty gritty and get your thoughts on some of this space that's just evolving so quickly. So thank you again for taking the moment. Can you, everyone, your mic's on, Abby, you're good to go?
My mic's on, we're good to go. So,
all right, wonderful. Well, so let me start maybe just with a general question for you, Abby. So as we're watching this democratization of information through digital platforms, again, they're growing and they're evolving incredibly rapidly, in real time almost. What new opportunities do you see that evolution creating, both from the corporate side, but also from the consumer side? I think they're quite different potentially.
They're quite different, but I think there's some synergies. So, I think you started teeing this up in your presentation, which is, I think now there's a greater opportunity for true engagement. I think, like you said, the old school model of kind of like a top-down communications approach where, either a trusted source or institution or entity or company would disseminate information that, the masses would then absorb and, act on it as they will, has now changed. I also think if you just think of this through the lens of, the social justice era that we are now living and breathing, right? The expectations of companies is now different,
Yes.
right? So not only are you no longer that go-to source, but there's now an expectation, like you were saying, not only that you take a stand, but that you actually have some meaningful form of engagement. Because no one's looking to sit on their hands and just receive information. People are very vocal. Social has given many people platforms to express and articulate opinions. And, there are a lot of expectations on behalf of a range of stakeholders that companies do act, say, and engage. So I think there's actually a huge opportunity for companies to start meeting their key stakeholders where they are, identify those shared values, purposes, missions, and activations that they actually can work together on. Because if you think of the larger framework and world that we're living in, well, what we've talked about are seemingly communications problems, right? They all ladder up to much larger issues that we're facing in terms of the systems that have failed us all, right? I think, a key learning from COVID-19 is the fact that the pandemic that is racism is here. It is here. It has been here to stay. But more importantly, people are no longer willing to tolerate that status quo, right? We're really looking to dismantle and break through the existing systems to get to a better place of equity. And engagement is one key way of getting us there. To answer the second part of your question around consumers, I think consumers now are not only becoming more savvy, but they're becoming greater advocates for themselves, right? And their communities. Because if you think of this through the lens of amplifying the voices of the people who've been underrepresented or underserved, COVID has shown us that there are people who are meaningful influencers. There are people who want to be engaged. There are people who are demanding access, better care, and so on. And with the access to all the information that they have the knowledge base that they need to start advocating for what they want.
Yeah.
So all of that to me really tells me that we're moving from the traditional model to a much more dynamic model. And like you said, you have to either get out of the way or just become part of the actual process. And I would say, to invoke one of my favorite influencers in this space, Melanie Hobson, we are living civil rights 3.0, and now it's at the feet of corporate America to actually help move the needle. So I think the data that you just walked us through gives us some meaningful insight in terms of how we can guide companies and clients to a better place, achieving some of those larger goals.
Yeah, along those lines, are you seeing sort of that recognition moment amongst corporate America that this is we need to be in this space, or do you see it sort of like a big ship taking a while to turn? Or to me, it feels like the moment in time they do not have the patience for a slow turn.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has patience for the slow turn anymore, because we also live in a call-out culture where people will be canceled, literally, if they don't kind of get on the bus, if you will. And our relevance data, which we presented 2 cuts of last year, point very clearly towards that. When you look at how companies responded following the murder of George Floyd last year, there were some who not only responded with, swiftly, but they responded in truly empathetic, emotive, and authentic ways. And there were others who were either slow to the take or didn't respond at all. And those companies were the ones who got called out, not only just by their employees, but others who track them. So, the corporate playbook, if you will, that we're accustomed to has long been thrown out of the window. And I think everyone knows now that they've got to really start stepping up and standing up. And it's like you said, going beyond just the platitudes. Like last year was the year of all the statements. This year is the year of action, because come December, I guarantee you everyone's going to be checking for the receipts to see who's done what and who's falling behind.
Right. Yeah, no, that is I think a critical moment. And already I see questioning of what you said, that you said all the right things last year about what have you done for me lately. And
right.
Yeah, that's going to be a very interesting accountability moment for the corporate world. So now, which very interestingly, I think that leads me into another sort of thought or question, and that is that government normally is the one who's the centerpiece for this type of who's accountable for this kind of systemic racism and other, sort of social justice issues. But it seems like this corporate America is now being pointed to as the catalyst or the potential champion because, government somehow is clearly, there's no faith that they're actually going to be able to solve this problem.
Mhm.
How do you see that landscape actually, changing the equation? To me, it's the first time it's, I think, really happened.
I mean, I would say, and you started to allude to this. I mean, there's a lot of data that we've seen in the last few years that points to the fact that trust in established institutions has eroded significantly. I would say probably in the last, 6 to 8 years, right? Because when you look at things that have happened here in the US with the election of Donald Trump, what we've even seen earlier this year with the insurrection, and then you've seen it globally, right, with Brexit and so on. There are these huge divides, right, in terms of what people want and need from those institutions, the questions that they have about not only their credibility, but more importantly, what they're doing to support their communities. I think that has severely eroded trust in government. But I think if you also just look at the mindset and beliefs of the upcoming generations, Gen Zs and millennials, right? They are very, very much focused on values and purpose. And they expect not only their institutions, but their employers and the brands that they engage with to stand for something and mean something. So I think that's been one of the catalysts for the responsibility being kind of put at the feet of corporate America. I think also just given the mistrust, if you will, in institutions like government, corporate America, which is an entity that employs all of us, but also is meant to help us when it comes to both wealth and kind of just overall employment opportunities, actually is a key stakeholder in helping us bridge some of those gaps, right? Because if you look at this through the framework of the different systems that get in the way of people really being able to survive, thrive, and live in a sustainable way. I mean, there's health and well-being, right? But there's also things related to employment and so on. So I think that for those reasons, corporations are really truly responsible in some way for supporting their employee base and their communities, right? And a lot of that also goes back to the mission and vision of the companies that we either support or work for, right? Because if it is you say that you believe in X, right, or you stand by Y, then you've got to follow through. I know there's pitfalls that come with that, right? Because how far should companies go in truly being caretakers of their employees and communities? And I think a lot of that comes back to mission and vision, right? And a lot of that also needs to be predicated on kind of the shared responsibilities and aspirations that you have with your employees and your communities, because you're going to need to set up some of those guardrails, right? Because we can't do and be all things to all people.
Right.
But I do think that, there's a critical role that companies can play.
So, that's, I think, a powerful concept. And I'd like to zoom in a little bit more on the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece of the discussion. And really, one of the things that I think the last year clearly showed us was, with a pretty glaring spotlight, is that the disparity that still exists between the haves and the have-nots, those who have access to the digital world and those who don't have equal access to the digital world. I've seen the digital sort of opportunity or moment be touted as the solution, the panacea that will solve all of this, because it will equalize everything.
Right.
Is that really the case? I think we saw last year with public education going online. I mean, that is not the case. It is not a fair, level playing field in any way, shape, or form. And so access is a critical piece to this digital solution. And is it there, or do you see it getting there soon enough?
It's definitely not there yet, because for as much as the hypothetical, I think, it's a brilliant, I think, pipe dream in some ways. I mean, the reality is, like you said, there are clear divides, right? Because access is truly part of privilege, and not everyone has that. And I think to solve it, that's where we really have to look at overall infrastructure, right? And that's where state, local governments, depending on where you live, your federal government probably plays a role in terms of not only giving people just free access to things like internet and Wi-Fi, right? But also putting things in place so that people actually have access to the devices that they need, right? To be able to access information, right? Because you could have a smartphone of some kind, but if you don't have access to Wi-Fi, that defeats the purpose, right? So we need to make sure that from an infrastructure perspective, that we put all of the key things in place to make sure that we could truly bridge those divides. Because when you're able to, I think there are startups in digital health that have shown that by being able to connect with people in different ways, just based on the tools that they have, you're able to not only give people the emotional support that they need, but most importantly, give them the access to the care that they need and want. So I think we can get there, but we've got to actually seriously think of the infrastructure and solve for the gaps that exist to make sure that everyone has access to what they need.
Yeah, and do you feel like, again, when we talk about the response, who's responsible for solving that problem? I mean,
Right.
Is that a government responsibility, or is that a corporate responsibility, since they're the ones who are sort of, creating the devices, creating the technology, they're the ones selling the technology, they set the prices. Where does the ownership sort of fall on that scale?
I mean, I would say that if you're a company that has a vested interest in health from whatever your wheelhouse is, I do think you play a role in that, right? Because if you are, for example, a pharmaceutical company that has put a stake in the ground as it relates to health equity with, say, specific disease states that we know disproportionately affect certain segments of our population who may be BIPOC or underserved in some way, you do need to think about the things that you're going to put in place to help serve those communities, right? Because it's more than just developing a treatment that could potentially help a disease. It's making sure that people, have, resources to want to afford the drugs, right? It's making sure that people have ways to be able to have a conversation with a physician. It's making sure that they have ways to have the touch points to manage their disease, right? The kind of health and well-being perspective goes beyond just a pill. And if it is that you're making those commitments, you have to follow through, right? Because for as much as, making drug X available for disease Y may seem like a quick win and it's checking the box, it's more than that, right? You have to be in it for the long game. And I think that's another key takeaway when you kind of look at where we were with COVID. We've all started to realize that solving health problems of today are no longer just quick fixes. When you're looking at engaging with your communities and trying to bridge divides, be it through literacy, be it through access and so on, you need to be in it to win it. It has to be more than just transactional. You have to be in it for the long haul.
So along those lines, how early in the to me, it seems like, you're arguing that product launch is the time when that consideration has to be already there, rather than an afterthought when, we knew who our market was, we knew we had our business case lined up, we launched successfully to them, and then, we have this social sort of side of it that we'll deal with later.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say quite frankly, it comes like as early as the R&D stages, right? Because you're looking at a continuum of care. So if it is, for example, that you're creating a medicine, like I said, for a disease that impacts one community, right? You need to think, when you're creating your medicine and designing your trials, for example, you need to make sure that your trials are representative of the community that this disease impacts and this drug could potentially benefit from. So it's as early as designing your clinical trials. It's as early as engaging the patient advocacy community, or just the community that represents that patient population in the conversations, not only around trial design, but how you best engage and educate, right? How do you make sure that people have the right levels of awareness through the actual regulatory process, right? I mean, we now are living in the time of COVID where when drugs are put up for review by the FDA, we're now doing these hearings virtually versus actually doing them in person, but it's also making sure they have seats at the table when you're making the case for that medicine, all the way through launch and beyond. It's really, truly going from, as we like to say in our business, from bench to bedside, from the moment that person is looking in that microscope to figure out what this molecule is going to look like, to the day the product comes to market and beyond.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing, length of chain, and that's a 10-year process that you just described. And for that to be a part of the conversation, the entire length of that process would really make a difference. I mean, would be sort of game changing in terms of how that end product gets
And product gets
effectively. Yeah,
for
no,
sure.
it's
Sure.
would be
And I
wonderful.
mean, it's a whole model that I know where everyone now is trying to solve for, because like you said, up until last year, we kind of did it piecemeal where people thought it was appropriate. But I think, we now know that that form of engagement is no longer acceptable, and the table stakes have changed.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, I guess maybe we should, kind of wrap up a little bit, at least give the audience a little chance for some time with you, probably more than me. But as we wrap up here today, can we leave our audience with your thoughts on like some of the key challenges that their organizations they need to be thinking about within their organizations, both at the awareness level, but also in what's the actionable things that need to be happening. And can they use this moment? I attended this webinar today. Hey, there was an interesting sort of discussion, and can I catalyze that discussion within my own organization? What are some ideas you have to give them tools to do that?
Tools to do that. I mean, I think it's really through the lens of considerations, right? In terms of how we think about engagement. And I mean, I'm going to deliberately repeat some points because I think repetition is key in terms of making sure that not only information resonates, but again, people start to operationalize this. Because, given the fact that we are in the year of action, right? One of the things that we've seen is companies wanting to do and or say things because they feel that they have to because of the expectations, right? But a key consideration there is to make sure that whatever you do and say really truly not only ladders up to what your mission is, but most importantly, it has to actually be tied to things that you've done, right? Because if you don't have any stake, claim, or skin in the game, you lose authenticity if you actually attempt to do and say something just for the sake of doing so. Platitudes are no longer acceptable. I also think companies need to think of ways that they could serve as both conveners and amplifiers, right? Knowing that we now are in a world of influence, there is definitely a role that companies can play in terms of amplifying voices, particularly of those who've been underserved or underrepresented. One of the key things we saw last year in terms of voices who got elevated was the fact that established sources, and you mentioned celebrities, I know in your research, there was a whole share of the mic movement last summer, which I'm not sure if all of you remember, where you found people like Gwyneth Paltrow and others actually turning over their social media platforms to up and coming health influencers in the BIPOC community to talk about the mental health impact of COVID, right? Those were moments where people who had established reach and established audiences were able to truly amplify those who were previously underrepresented, or people may not actually have known much of it. So I think there's a huge opportunity for companies to leverage their credibility and their reach to help elevate the voices of those who we know not only haven't been represented, but most importantly, can help advance mission and vision, right? I think lastly, that also kind of helps show how you're really, truly willing to engage in a different way. Right now, anyone who wants to step up needs to step up in the right way, and collaboration is critical, right? Gone are the days where you come in as the expert with the credible, name that you can help guide people along. The white knight syndrome is gone. It's all about partnership and collaboration, moving away from transactional to true engagement.
Awesome, amazing. Yeah, so I guess let's give our virtual audience a chance to engage. Hopefully they've had some thought-provoking moments, and this is their chance to really sort of silence. If you hold that in now, you don't complain later when you still don't know the answer, right? So now's the moment to speak.
Thanks. I feel like a TV reporter with all the interesting things happening behind me. So hopefully it won't be too distracting. I don't have like an option to blur my video. Everyone else can do it, but I don't know. I said maybe update my Zoom account. So there's a question in the Q&A, and it's from Olga. Hi, Olga. And and I want to add a couple things to it. So first, she says, good morning. There's a present ongoing doubt on messages received by government, scientists, and other experts. I mean, even the CDC. And we've seen this with like governors in the US who are like, oh, I'm not going to follow guidelines this year, especially with the upcoming school season. So what parameters should we follow to know what's truth and what's conspiracy? I mean, the other thing I think that's really important is, and we talked about disinformation, what's trusted sources, is also when you go into Google, if you hit a source that is misinformation, you're more likely to hit other sources that are misinformation based on the algorithm. So how can we help be like facilitators of truth and sources, and does it make a difference to, certain communities?
I'm going to answer the second part of that first, because from a community perspective, I think what we've seen in COVID, which was a learning that I think we knew in the run up to it, but I think it became even more critical during the pandemic, which is the importance of trusted messengers, right? Because if you look at, for example, the initiatives that have been put in place to drive vaccine acceptance in the Black community during COVID, a lot of the voices that you saw who were deemed influential were the people who were bastions of the community and truly seen as trusted messengers. And those people ended up being the go-to sources. People who were members of the faith-based community, people who were well-known doctors and academicians who were tied to historic Black colleges and universities. Those community trusted messengers were key in terms of not only educating their communities, but serving as resources of information. I think to answer the first part of the question about kind of broader information sources, I mean, I think we all know, and this is a whole different debate that will probably warrant a whole another webinar, which in terms of the rationale behind the misinformation or disinformation that was coming from certain government sources, because we know their underlying motivations behind that. One of the things, though, that I know that we have seen, and WHO and Real Chemistry has done analytics on this, is looking at the influential voices who rose to the top, who were different from the typical tried and true, right? I think there's now probably about 10 to 15 physicians who are accredited and tied to relevant institutions who really truly served as trusted voices. And it's one because of not only the plain spoken way in which they actually conveyed their messages, but the fact that everything they did and said was founded in science.
So to add on, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
I 100% agree, especially with that last piece. It's a passion project for me, is that ability to convey science in a way that is approachable and understandable is something that I think is a gap that needs to be closed. With our, so any of the communication folks who are out there right now, if you have the opportunity, again, all the way back to R&D, if you have the opportunity to help some of those scientific people in your organization figure out how to tell their story in that way that is effective and approachable, the value of that is huge. It's just not something that they are trained to do over their careers. They're deep technical people, right? So finding those unicorns who can do both is sometimes hard, right? Yeah. But you can help them, transfer that skill. So if you see an opportunity to do so, I encourage you. I know that they will thank you for it once they realize its value. Sometimes they're so focused on their research that they don't see that big picture. But once they do, they can be super effective communicators with the right tools.
Yeah, I think the other challenge, though, is, we can talk about science and the importance of science, but that's not necessarily going to persuade certain communities. And we've even seen political divides with who's getting vaccinated and who's not. And I feel like we're at a point where we're sort of stuck, right? I mean, you see Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, if they're two of the top influencers, they're not motivating certain groups of the population to get vaccinated. So then it's a matter of what can organizations do, and not just corporations, but what can organizations really do, and even what is their responsibility to employees and trying to encourage vaccination, especially since we just saw that both Google and Facebook are requiring vaccination. What do you anticipate is sort of the shift into this as we move to trying to get that vaccine acceptance and acceptance?
I mean, the conundrum I think that lies with that is the fact that if you look at data historically in terms of vaccine hesitancy across a range of countries, the US included, I mean, there has always been a very strong anti-vax contingent. And I think in terms of getting us all back to a place of thriving and well-being, I think there's an understanding that there are hurdles that are going to have to be surmounted, if you will, to try to get us there. I think that's where, again, looking at different types or spheres of influence in the community to try to move people along it's critical, right? Because while some people might look to Barack and Hillary, there are others who might, I'm just making this up, look to like their local radio DJ, right? So we need, you need to take both a national and kind of a local grassroots approach, because the only way you're truly going to start moving people county by county, city by city, is looking at all of the different influencers and spheres of influence in their communities to help move them along, right? There's some instances in which, people rely on word of mouth. And if they see, 3 family members, converted and going to get vaccinated, that might encourage others to do it. But, you've got to think of who they look to for information, how best to convey that information, right? Because the message may not necessarily be, you have to get the vaccine for this reason, right? It may need to be framed through the lens of life goals or life things that you want to be able to actually accomplish. We're actually doing work with the Black Coalition Against COVID, and there was a whole series we did about Black doctors reading tweets, and the tweets were all about the things that we want to get back to. Once you start to frame the information through the lens of aspirational lifestyle things that you've missed out on, for example, because of the pandemic, you can start to see mindsets change.
Yeah, I appreciate that you said about the local sources. We do an annual disinformation study, and by far, the political divide is bridged together through local sources. Both on both sides of the political spectrum trust like local newspapers and local broadcasts more so than most other sources. So that's a really good point. Okay, so there's another question. Let's see. For those of us who work for organizations whose messaging is highly regulated by regulatory, legal, and government entities, it can be challenging to partner in quotes, since those channels are not entirely owned or controlled. Do you have any advice on how to collaborate with a trusted, influential messenger when your organization is used to exclusively talking to their audience?
So when they say organization, does that mean like certain people within the organization? Because I'll tell you, if you just think of the world that we're in now, in terms of addressing not only issues around health equity, but also just, wealth and opportunity gaps and so on. For example, there's been a huge push towards engaging historic Black colleges. There's also a huge push towards engaging well-known community organizations that are trusted messengers in the Black community. And we've had several instances in which we've had clients come to us saying, how do I get to talk to X person at Y place, when either I don't have a relationship or I work in an environment where, the way in which I approach or engage these organizations is highly regulated, right? I think the first order of business to figure out is this something that you truly want to focus on and is going to be meaningful to your organization? Because if so, then I think you've got to get consensus in terms of what the outreach looks like, and then who's going to actually broker that engagement, right? And that's where I think identifying potential partners within your organization or people who have relationships with those groups, I think is going to be critical, because right now, most people who are in the BIPOC community who've seen established companies or others want to reach out to them are slightly suspicious, because up until last year, no one really did much. No one really seemed to care. Now everyone does, right? And no one is no longer going to be tolerant of that transactional interaction, right? So the question becomes, one, who's the person who's going to serve as your advocate and voice to help make the introduction? But then most importantly, once you actually get a seat at that table, what does that conversation look like, and what are you actually committing to? Right? Because you may want to engage, but you have to be mindful of the fact that you have to go beyond the transaction, right? You need to be in it for the long haul and be willing to truly partner and collaborate. Because without those, one, no one's going to truly meaningfully want to engage, but two, you're not going to get the payoff, if you will, from the investment that you're looking to make.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with more with you. And I think this is a moment where there has to be a recognition that to change requires taking on some risk, right? So
Right.
you know, the perfect thing, and I've been in many sort of legal discussions where the perfect answer from the legal perspective is if we just do nothing, the risk is zero. Fantastic, right? But so at that senior sort of strategic level, getting that as those guardrails in place, that commitment, that acceptable level of risk that is going to have to be there to do something meaningful and change is the conversation that if it sounds like maybe it hasn't happened in this person's organization, but that's the one that needs to happen before you can sort of get this culture change within your organization and that you can broadcast out of your organization.
Right. And I'd also say, again, if it is that your company is one that has made certain commitments or has spoken about certain missions and values, you're going to have to be willing to, like you said, take that risk, because you will get called out if you continue to articulate something that is actually not real.
Okay, so we're winding down the webinar. We have like just a couple minutes left, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time, but maybe just a couple takeaways from each of you. If you want people, I mean, Abby, you said repetition, so let's do, what is the takeaway? Like, give us if nothing else, I want you to leave this webinar and think about X. So who wants to go first?
I will defer to you, Abby. I think
We'll defer to me. I'm willing to go.
I got 10 minutes. I got 10 minutes to deliver my platform at the beginning solo. So
I think we all just need to recognize that the world we're living in is truly dynamic and it is different. And given that, we just need to be comfortable with the change that we're living through and we're going to have front row seats to, and be willing to take the risks that we need to take to really show up the way we all are committing to.
Yeah. And I guess for me, I would point to the fact that, again, I mean, you know, sort of, if you want to use greed or fear as a motivator in some cases, right? I mean, you should be afraid of not being a part of this disruptive moment. This is absolutely, it's way past the tipping point. It is full on into adoption, on the way past even the peak adoption curve, I would say. Yeah. And it really is a moment in time when, if you are not on board now, you better be a fast follower, because you already missed out on your opportunity to be a leader. So, you know, do so at your own peril. And the speed at which this change is happening means that you can't even defer for very long before it's too late for you, and you're already in a death spiral that you don't know you exist in. So again, ignore it at your own peril, because it is real and it's here to stay.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much, Jason and Abby, for being here. We really appreciate it. And I also wanted to thank Gary Graves, our trustee from Real Chemistry, and Alan Chumley, who have been great in helping with this webinar, as well as Dr. Gina Luttrell. So thank you all for being here. This will be recorded and we will send it out. So hope to see you again soon. Thanks again.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Thank you.